If you've been a Jehovah's Witness for any considerable length of time, you'll be very well aware that the religion has a disproportionately high number of unhappy marriages. I have several thoughts on why I think this is the case. So that's what I'll be talking about today on this week's episode of the Jexit podcast. Hello and welcome to the Jexit podcast. I'm your host Riley, a former Jehovah's Witness who left the religion in 2019. So I'm currently sitting in my living room on Sunday morning of the 9th of June, and it's an absolutely glorious day. The sun is already shining really brightly. It's really warm, and I just wish the weather was like this yesterday because Marsha, myself, and our friend Mickey, also known as Apostate Barbie, travelled to Brighton by the sea for an XJW meetup. And the weather left a lot to be desired. It wasn't too cold, but it was extremely windy, which made it feel really cold. And the sky was grey, there was barely any sunshine, and I just wish that yesterday's weather was like today's. But we had a really good time nonetheless. I got to meet several people for the first time. They were all really lovely, and we got on really well and had some really nice conversations. And it's one of those conversations that inspired the topic for today's episode. I got talking to a lovely couple. They're an older couple. They've been married for several decades, and they left the organization round about the time of COVID, after being Jehovah's Witnesses for many, many years. And how we got into the subject of marriage is that while we were talking, Marsha mentioned that it was so nice to see that they're still together because so many XJW couples either break up because one of them wakes up and the other one doesn't, or after both leaving the organization, they realize that they don't really have anything in common, or that they're different people, or they've changed to the point where they're no longer compatible. And we all agreed that it is actually, unfortunately and very sadly, a rare thing for a couple to wake up from the JW indoctrination, leave the organization together, and stay together. So naturally, this got me thinking about why JW marriages are so bad. I have first-hand experience of this, and I've known many couples throughout my time in the organization that were in bad marriages. However, having said all of that, I have known couples in the organization who had very good marriages. But here's the interesting thing. All the good marriages that I've observed in the religion were good for the same reasons. They all had a common theme running through their marriages, which in my opinion made them good marriages. There are two things in particular that I've observed in such couples, and they are this. Firstly, they love each other more than they love Jehovah. Now, if you know anything about JW doctrine and JW marriages, you'll know straight away that that is a big no-no. Jehovah's Witnesses are told constantly that Jehovah should be the most important person in each and every one of their lives. For a married Jehovah's Witness, their relationship with their spouse should and must come secondary to their relationship with Jehovah. As a Jehovah's Witness, I was never fully on board with this idea, but now as a worldly person, a baby worldly person who's only been 5 years, this notion is absolutely crazy to me. Essentially, the moment a Jehovah's Witness enters into a relationship with another Jehovah's Witness, they know that they are not a priority in that person's life. As a married Jehovah's Witness, you know that your spouse is going to place spiritual things, and I use that term loosely, and congregational activities over and above you, and you are expected to do the same. To me, This just undermines the foundation of a good marriage right from the very beginning. How on earth could a couple hope to have a happy and successful marriage when each of them knows that they are not the most important person in their partner's life? It makes no sense whatsoever. But as I said, with the couples I observed who did have good, successful and happy marriages, they had this idea the correct way around. Actually, talking about this reminds me of a demonstration, well, not quite a demonstration, an experience that I saw at a circuit assembly. So there was a couple being interviewed on the platform, and the husband was actually a substitute circuit overseer. And they were a pioneer couple, and they were being held up as an example of a fine Christian marriage. So at some point during the interview, they were asked what they think makes their marriage so successful. And the answer that the husband gave was their love for Jehovah, the fact that they each individually put Jehovah first. Honestly, I feel nauseous just telling you about this. This whole thing is so cringy. But it gets worse. So the husband mentioned that they both went out on the ministry the morning of their wedding day. Yes, you heard me correctly. On the day they got married, they woke up and went out on the ministry and then went to the Kingdom Hall and got married later that day when they'd finished knocking on doors. And they were being praised by the entire circuit for doing that. Now, I know I'm saying this with 2020 hindsight, but if that doesn't scream cult, I don't know what does. And the reason I say that is because in my mind, when I hear the word cult, to me, that word conjures up the idea of an environment where individuals don't matter. Your happiness, your goals, your dreams, your aspirations, your hobbies, your interests, everything that makes you, you, everything that makes you a unique individual is secondary, if it even registers as a priority at all. So much so that even on the day of your wedding, arguably one of the most important days a human being could ever have, when they make a commitment, what should be a lifelong commitment to another person, that takes second place to serving an organization. The word crazy doesn't even come close to describing what this is. But as I said earlier, with the few couples that I knew who did have good marriages, they had this idea the correct way round, where they prioritized each other and each other's happiness, even over and above, quote unquote, spiritual things, their relationship with Jehovah and serving the organization. By way of example, there's one couple that I knew really well who would regularly skip meetings to go to the seaside. And not just the seaside, other family outings. And they saw that as being essential to keeping and maintaining a happy marriage and a happy family life. They were both busy people, but they saw the value in spending quality time with each other. And the only time that they could fit that in would be to substitute it for one of the weekly meetings. But they saw it as so important that they didn't have a problem doing that. Now, the second thing that I've observed among the very few good JW marriages is this. They ignored the organization's guidance and advice relating to the prescribed roles for husbands and wives within a marriage. They ignored the advice and worked things out themselves. The gender roles within the JW religion, especially within marriages, are extremely strict. They are very inflexible. It's very much a case of these are all the things that must be done by the husband, and these are all the things that must be done by the wife, and never the twain shall meet. But the realistic truth of the matter is this. That is not going to work, at least not work very well, for most couples. Why? Again, It's because, and you're going to get fed up of hearing me say this, not just in this episode, but all the time, because it's something I feel very strongly about. Human beings are individuals. There are no absolutes when you're speaking about people, even people within one specific gender group. All men are not the same and all women are not the same. Now, I'm not being ridiculous. Of course, I understand that there are certain traits that are more commonly associated with men, and there are certain other traits that are more commonly associated with women. That is a fact. But with such strict, mandated adherence to these rigid, inflexible gender roles within the religion, what happens when a couple, for any reason, doesn't fit perfectly into these prescribed roles? What happens to them? What if a JW husband is more adept at or more comfortable with performing domestic tasks than his wife? And what if his wife is either better educated or has more professional skills, which make her capacity for earning higher than her husband's? What do they do? Well, if they're good Jehovah's Witnesses, they'll follow the organization's guidance and try really, really hard to squeeze themselves into the roles that have been set out for them. But I'm sure you can see how this will lead to a lot of frustration and unhappiness. And I have first-hand experience of this because my marriage within the religion had very similar problems. As a JW husband, I was told that there were certain things I had to do and certain ways I had to be as part of my role. But some of those things, and I won't go into detail as to specifically what they are, but some of those things just didn't sit well with me. Either I wasn't very good at them or they didn't align with my personality type. But I was told that I had to do them anyway. And that was extremely uncomfortable. It felt like I was a square peg being forced into a round hole. Now project that situation forward for several years, decades even, and it's just a recipe for disaster. It's a car crash waiting to happen. First of all, there's the discomfort and awkwardness of the situation itself, and then all of the frustration, turmoil, and unhappiness that ensues as a result. But then there's the huge toll it takes on you emotionally and psychologically. If you have been taught all your life that men are like this, therefore men do these things, and women are like that, and therefore women do those things, but you yourself as a man or a woman are not like that and find it difficult to do those things, but then being told that you have to do them anyway, you're basically being told that there's something wrong with you. That's the underlying message. If your prescribed gender role within a marriage is ill-fitting, but you're told that you have to fit it anyway, it's the same as being told that you're broken. Because the problem isn't with the role and its inflexibility. The problem is with you. You are malformed. Again, I speak from personal experience. There is absolutely no way that that message over the course of many years isn't going to take a huge toll on your mental and emotional health. It's psychologically damaging. And again, the few JW couples I knew of who did have good marriages ignored all of that advice, were flexible with the roles that were prescribed for them, and just settled into their own groove. I knew several elders and ministerial servants who got their wives to do the congregation accounts or the territory mapping for them. And not because they were too busy to do it themselves, but because their wives were better at those things than they were. In fact, the couple that I met yesterday, who I mentioned earlier, they had a very similar experience that they told me about. Now, I would be remiss during this conversation if I didn't mention the one thing which, in my opinion, is the biggest reason why JW marriages are so unhappy, and that is getting married for the wrong reasons. Now, the most obvious wrong reason that many JWs get married for is certainly the first one that springs to my mind whenever I speak about this subject, and I'm almost certain that it's the one you're thinking of as well, is the dreaded S word, sex. Because, let's face it, who makes good decisions when they're horny? I know I certainly don't. As is the case with many Christian denominations, there is no sex before marriage in the JW religion, which leads to a whole host of problems, not least sexual frustration and repression, to name just two. But as I said, that is the glaringly obvious reason. But there are also some other not so obvious reasons, which are bad reasons to marry another person. Namely, their quote unquote spirituality. Jehovah's Witnesses are told that the first and foremost thing they should look for in a prospective marriage mate is spirituality. First of all, the JW definition of the word spirituality isn't spirituality at all in any meaningful sense of the word. It's essentially a code word for how hard a person works for the Watchtower organization. For example, do they prepare for all the meetings? If so, how thoroughly do they prepare? Do they comment at the meetings? Are they regular in the field ministry? Do they have Bible studies? If they're a man, are they appointed or at least reaching out to be appointed in the congregation? If they're a woman, are they regular pioneering or regular auxiliary pioneering? Within the religion, all of these things act as social indicators as to someone's suitability as a prospective marriage mate. Again, with 2020 hindsight, this is absolutely crazy to me. If you are going to spend the rest of your life potentially with another person, why is how hard they work for a corporation masquerading as a religion of any relevance whatsoever? Some far better questions to ask would be these. Do we share any common interests? Do we agree on whether or not we would like to have children? Do we have compatible goals and aspirations? But in the JW religion, these logical, practical, common sense questions, given the commitment one is about to make potentially, take second place to service in the organization. It's a recipe for disaster, and it is yet another way in which this organization undermines the individuality and the identity of its members. And I'm going to explain what I mean by that with a personal experience. So early on in my first marriage, my wife of the time and I started having problems. Looking back on the situation now, I can clearly see that our problems were rooted in the fact that we just weren't compatible. So as faithful Jehovah's Witnesses, we did the smart thing that was expected of us, and we sought help from the elders. We met with several different elders on many different occasions, but it was on one such occasion where I received the worst marriage advice I have ever been given in my entire life. In fact, I think it's the worst piece of marriage advice that I've ever heard from anyone, anywhere in my entire life. I mentioned to the elder in question that it was my strong belief and opinion that my wife of the time and I just were not compatible as marriage mates. And both my wife and the elder strongly disagreed. But not only did they disagree, they were convinced and were trying to convince me that the idea of compatibility in a marriage is a quote unquote worldly one. Yes, you heard that correctly. They were telling me that I was displaying a worldly attitude and worldly thinking regarding marriage, simply for the fact that I thought that marriage mates should be compatible. The elder said to me that any two people can be married and happy and have a successful marriage as long as they followed Bible principles. Any two people, their personalities, their likes, their dislikes do not matter. The only thing that matter is that they both follow Bible principles and everything will work. Now, this was absolutely crazy to me, even as a full believing, fully indoctrinated Jehovah's Witness as I was at the time, because I reasoned to myself that sometimes people just don't get on. Even two people at the early stages of a purely platonic friendship can suddenly realize that they just don't have anything in common or their personalities aren't compatible. If that simple and undeniable fact can apply to friendships, how much more so could it apply to a marriage? So I questioned the elder on this further because this made no sense to me whatsoever. I said to him, okay, if that is the case, that any two people can get married and have a happy and successful marriage as long as they both follow Bible principles, then that means that if I were single, I could marry Liberty, who is a sister in our congregation. And as long as we both apply Bible principles, we would be happy. Is that the case? And this elder looked me square in the face and said, yes. Now, what you need to understand about this sister Liberty, which will make his answer so ridiculous, is that she was an East German woman in her 90s. I was a young man born and raised in South London in my 20s. And he was trying to tell me that I could marry her and be happy, or she could marry me and be happy as long as we both applied Bible principles. What an absolute joke. But having said all that, when you look at this situation from the perspective of it being a cult, which I didn't do at the time, obviously, because I didn't know I was in a cult. Now, looking back, I can see that fact clearly, because this is what cults do. They render individuals and their personalities and their identities completely irrelevant. In one way or another, they try to make all of their members the same. They try to make them look the same, act the same, speak the same, and think the same. And the only way to do this is to strip away everything that makes a person unique. So with that being the case, then of course any two cult members can marry each other and have a successful marriage. Or so the thinking goes. So taking all of this into consideration, it's really not surprising that so many couples who wake up and learn the truth about the truth, leave the organization together, ultimately end up breaking apart. Because once they start that process of reclaiming their identity, their individuality, and start living as their authentic selves, they realize that they don't have anything in common. They don't really have a strong basis or foundation for the relationship they have. Essentially, they are not compatible. And then sadly, their marriage becomes yet another casualty of this horrible, despicable organization. Another reason why I think JW marriages are so bad is that Jehovah's Witnesses tend to get married extremely young. Most Jehovah's Witnesses get married in their late teens or early to mid-20s. which is a really young age to be making such an important and potentially lifelong commitment. I learned recently that the adult brain doesn't fully mature until round about the age of 25. Now, I'm a massive nerd. I absolutely love learning. And there's a YouTube channel that I subscribe to that's all about human anatomy. And they actually have human cadavers in their videos for demonstration purposes. So I recently watched a video from that channel that was all about the human brain. Now, there's a part of the brain, the prefrontal cortex, and that region of the brain is involved in decision making. And it's that specific part of the brain that doesn't fully mature until round about the age of 25. So that being the case, I don't think it's unreasonable to say that anyone under the age of 25 or anyone who doesn't have this region of the brain fully matured as yet should not really be making decisions that affect the rest of their life, because they don't yet have the tools or the capability to make such decisions for the right reasons. Another relevant factor as to why JW marriages are so bad is the gender balance in the religion. When I was a Jehovah's Witness, which wasn't too long ago, women in the religion outnumbered men by a ratio of roughly 3-1. Now, it doesn't take a genius to work out that this situation leads to many women who want to be married realizing that they have an extremely limited pool of potential partners to choose from, which means that a single woman in the religion is more likely to marry the first person who shows some interest in her, regardless of whether or not they're actually a suitable partner. And you can see how this situation is going to lead to a lot of unhappy marriages because they've settled. But on the flip side of that, for a JW man who wants to get married, the possibilities are almost endless. There are so many single women in the religion who want to be in relationships that the men have to make very little effort in terms of personality and appearance in order to find someone who's willing to date them. I can't tell you how many JW men I've seen who walk around as if they are God's gift to women, whereas in the world, nobody would look at them twice. And this is all because the gender balance within the religion is so skewed. So those are my thoughts on why JW marriages are so bad and so unhappy. If you're an ex-JW who never married while you were in the organization, count yourself very lucky. If you did marry while in the organization and you and your spouse have both left and are still together, then I offer you a round of applause. You really do deserve it. And you have my utmost respect and admiration. I hope you enjoyed this episode. If so, please give it a thumbs up. And if you're listening to this on a podcasting platform, please rate the podcast, as this really helps to get it out to as many listeners as possible. And if you haven't already done so, please subscribe so that you're alerted each time I post new content. Thank you so much for listening. I hope you all have a great week.